We are here to discuss the famous painter Pavel Filonov. I think there is a common misconception about the isolation of Mr. Filonov and the analytical movement from the other avant-garde movements. When we approach Filonov's work, we are generally thinking about a very ascetic artist who is living in his own world and producing this kind of paintings. I think this is mostly caused by a perception that we have of the biography of the artist that comes out from his late 30s when he lost total financial support because he had he was deemed as a non-revolutionary artist. And we have such quotes, very famous quotes by his pupils, like Evgeny Kibrik, that says, by character he was an ascetic who unhesitantly put his views into practice. He lived on black bread, potatoes, and smoked low-grade tobacco. So, we have this idea of like the stereotypical genius painter that lives in his studio, that lives out of nothing, but actually if we take a look at his earlier biographical facts, we have a totally different picture, and we see that Filonov is a very communicative and engaged artist. His wife, for example, Ekaterina Serebrikova, was part of Народная воля, one of the most active political groups in Tsarist Russia, and he had continuously meetings at his home. Another important thing is that he was working in a school that was very similar to Moscow VHUTEMAS, that was the ГИНХУК, Государственный институт художественной культуры, where the director was Kazimir Malevich, and he was teaching general ideology. So we see a painter that is actually continuously engaged with society. And he was also going out of his field of work as much as typical practices of VHUTEMAS, and he worked with the TRAM, for example, the Театр рабочей молодежи, one of the most avant-garde theater groups, and he painted the sceneries for Vladimir Mayakovsky tragedy, way before Popova's The Coq Magnifique, also famous. And his teaching methods were very similar to VHUTEMAS, and his school, MAI, was extremely popular in the 20s. He had up to 70 students, many of them were also part of VHUTEMAS. So, I think to understand this relation, we should go also to look at his painting and see where this is possibly relatable, for example, with Suprematist or Constructivist painting. It has nothing to do, and it is very easy to misunderstand this as like a crazy idea of a crazy painter. Actually, this is all but a personal painting. This painting, Formula of Spring, is extremely important for different reasons. The main is that it is big, it is very big. It is like 3 meters per 2.5 meters, so it is meant to be displayed in a public space as a manifesto. Secondly, it was painted after one of the most important events from my school, that was the famous exhibition of Don Pecciati, after which his students gave him as a present this big canvas, so it has also symbolical meaning. And also because of the title, Formula. Formula in Filonov's language, in Filonov's way of giving a name to paintings, is extremely telling about some cosmic and deep and big events, as formula of universal flowering, as formula of Petrograd proletariat, formula of city, etc., etc., etc. So this is a painting that is meant to be a manifesto, a painting that is meant to describe the world and to communicate with the world. So his contemporaries as well understood that this painting was extremely important, and we have a quote from the diaries of Ekaterina Serebrikova. She is reporting a discussion between Filonov and one of his students, Volkov. I read it in Russian because I have no translation. It's like Волков спросил Филонова, почему вы одним и тем же методом подходите к живому существу, как, например, формула Городова, и к явлению природы, как, например, формула весны. Мне кажется, это явление разного порядка. Филонов ответил, что двух методов мышления быть не может, если один лишь метод диалектический, и им он не мерит все явления жизни. So, what does he say? Volkov asks him, a little bit silly, asks him, why do you use always the same way of painting to describe completely different formulas, completely different manifestations of reality? Like, for example, the city and spring, like the natural and the anthropological, or something like that. And Filonov says, dear Volkov, you know, there is just one way of describing reality, one way of painting, and it is the dialectic way of painting. So you see, this painting is meant to be a manifesto of a precise way of describing reality, and it is a way that is universal, is not personal. And we can say also that this dialectic is also pedagogical, because the basis of dialectic is always, there has always underlying pedagogical meaning. And we could try to analyze this painting with the same dialectical and pedagogical way that it was painted for it. So where does this, in the practice of painting, come out? We can divide this painting, which is extremely big, in many different areas. Each of them is like a self-staying composition, and each of these compositions are made by single units, atoms, that can be divided in, let's say, many ways, but two main families. One of basic shapes, which are made with geometrical forms and plain colors, and the other is kind of altered shapes, organic forms, textured with many different mixed uses. So the dialectical couple that is formed between two different basic pictorial units is what creates the dialectic of composition. So this different way in which these shapes interact possibly create any way of describing reality. And we have, according to different parts of the painting, different kinds of composition. From a very close static cellular unit where there are mostly geometrical shapes very, very close, like a cellular tissue, to a very dynamic area where there are many different planes, which looks very similar to suprematist painting in, let's say, as a concept, not as a pictorial rendering, but we have different planes, different geometrical shapes intersecting one with each other. And then we have any kind of, let's say, transition zones, which are somewhere in between this and that. If we try to map all of this, we see that actually the whole painting is taught as a big dialectical couple, where we have static zones and dynamic zones that are in continuous mixing and transition. So the whole painting is a living organism by itself. How does this possibly relate? for example, with Suprematism. We already saw some similarities, some basic concepts that are similar, but there is also a common philosophical conception about painting that we can read, for example, in their theoretical works, like Canon et Zakon, and we can maybe compare it to Lisitsky's Brun Manifesto. And we see that, for example, there is a common critique of futurism, cubofuturism as a surface painting that is not going enough deep in reality. There is a common understanding that painting itself should be autosufficient, which is an idea that here is centered around the concept of сделанность, maintenance. So each part, you see, is an independent part by itself. It could be a painting by itself. And it is similar to the idea of Brun, where the symbol, the sign, is giving meaning by itself. So we see that actually the interesting thing is that Filonov and the analytical movement is in the same way and is sharing the same basis with Cubism and Suprematism, for example, but the direction that they take and the results that they have are completely different. And this is mostly because the timing of painting in, let's say, Malevich is geometrical, is mathematical, is perfect, is clean. The process is important, but is, let's say, an analytical process. This is also an analytical process, but the timing is thick, is dense, is meant to describe the living life. It is like a meditation act that is creating continuously something living, something that is reproducing itself the whole time. And what can we say? Finito.